thrilled and honored that the keynote paper today is given by Professor Balagangadhara, or Professor Balu, as we know you from the University of Ghent. You are famous for many of your works, but here I just mention one book, the great monograph, The Heathen in His Blindness, Asia, the West, and the Dynamics of Religion, is a scholarly masterpiece, a wonderful work of constructing the knowledge that Europeans seem to have about India. But today, your keynote lecture is about the role of stories in Indian culture. So you are very welcome. Please take it over.
Thank you, Ülo. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start my paper, perhaps a word of truth introduction about the research program which you need to keep in the background to understand what I'm now going to say. Very briefly, I've been working on studying both Europe and India for the last 30 years or more. And I discovered in the course of my research, that is why I built a research program, that in the first place I discovered that what Europe spoke about India actually doesn't describe India at all. What it does is describe Europe's experiences with India. So, and what has happened in the last 300 years is that people both in Europe and elsewhere, and especially in India, people have taken European description of European experience of India with Indian culture itself. So much so that if you go to India, they will basically tell you what Europe has already told. That India has many religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism are there. India has a caste system. India, there's lots of corruption in India. All these stories actually are not stories about India. They're actually stories about European experience of India. And the Indians accept them. Not just Indians, the whole world in fact. So my problem was that to find out where, on the one hand, why did this description arise and why was it confused with truth about India on the one hand, and why Indians reproduce these stories on the other hand. I also was brought up with these stories, and of course, when I started doing that research, I discovered that there is a very interesting way of looking at the world, which is in a way to imitate partly what Europe has done. That is, if Europe has described its experience of India and studied India anthropologically, in manner of speaking, why can't India study Europe anthropologically? But against the background of Indian culture. By that I mean, there's no point in an Indian anthropologist coming to Europe and reproducing European anthropology. You know, what do people do in the shopping malls and stuff like that, which might be interesting, but which is hardly illuminating. But how does Europe look when you look at it from outside? What exactly is European culture? What is this famous Renaissance? What is this Reformation? What is this Enlightenment? Because if you look at European propaganda, the public relations department of Europe, you find that Europe comprises only of geniuses. Suddenly there is Renaissance. You know, Michelangelo comes there, Leonardo da Vinci comes there, and before you know there is Reformation, and then suddenly there is Enlightenment all over, from Scotland to Italy, and you have Immanuel Kant, you have Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and you have Karl Marx, all brilliant geniuses, and Isaac Newton, and, you know, Einstein and so on and so forth. All of them suddenly come from nowhere for 400 years. And of course India didn't produce anybody. There is not even a Karl Popper in India. Forget a little bit Wittgenstein. Not just India, the whole of Asia. Now there are of course two possibilities. That Asians are all stupid. It's logically possible. But very unlikely. Because evolutionarily speaking, it is not possible that only Europe has got geniuses. The rest of the world has got idiots. It's not possible. So why is it then that Asian culture, Indian culture, did not in the last 500 years produce any serious intellectuals? Why? In the process of, amongst other things, trying to answer the question, I discovered that that's because the kind of questions that Europe asked about human beings actually doesn't make sense to anyone who is not born within the framework of Semitic religion, meaning either a Jewish or a Muslim or a Christian. So the questions of Europe are not scientific questions, but are actually theological questions. And all its claims about human beings, that human beings have rights, about the nature of state, about the nature of law, all these things are basically secularized versions of Christian theology. And of course they don't make sense to people like Asians, like the Chinese, like the Japanese, like the Indians, who don't have these religions. So when we therefore take up the European research program, we cannot produce anything new, anything interesting, because these questions do not make sense to people who don't have these religions. So it is in that framework I've been working now for the last 30 years, studying many things, both about Europe, in a way rewriting the history of Europe itself, and also redescribing Indian culture. Now, I say all kinds of odd things. I need to say, let me put it very crudely, so that you know who is talking to you. If I am right, if my research program is right, the last 300-400 years of social sciences in the world is worthless, completely worthless. Your sociology, your political science, your philosophies of law, the theories of religion, just throw it into the dustbin, if I'm right. Of course, if I'm wrong, and I'm deluded, you know what delusion is, when you think that you're the greatest genius. I don't think so, but if I am that, if I've deluded myself, then I suppose there's no problem. I mean, everything is exactly the way it has been the last 300-400 years. In other words, there's no way is it possible to combine my story with what I'm going to tell you, with your classic understanding of the last 400 years. No matter where you come from, whether you come from a Marxist point of view, post-structuralist point of view, it doesn't matter. They're all the same, with variations, of course. So this is a kind of background from within which I'm going to present some considerations. I'll only focus very, very briefly on what stories are within the framework of my research program. Does anybody have problems with understanding my English? Do I speak too fast? No? You sure? Sure. Can I speak in an Indian accent? Okay. One of the characteristic properties of Indian society, something that strikes everyone with more than a vague acquaintance of this culture, is its variety and stock of stories. Indians relish telling stories. There are stories for every situation, and all reasons and explanations require stories, and their presence in the culture is ubiquitous. Clearly, if a child is exposed constantly to stories at all levels of social interaction, these stories end up playing an important role in the process of socializing. Therefore, it is reasonable to assert that they are vital ingredients in the process of learning to live with others. That is, in such a culture, stories would have to function as units of a learning process. By virtue of which property do stories play the role that I suggest they do? I'm rather hesitant to ascribe any internal or intrinsic properties to stories that enable them to be units of learning. I do not think that it makes a great deal of sense to speak of units of learning outside of learning process. However, given a specific kind of learning process, and I'll talk about it very soon, stories could be its units of learning because they do have some peculiar properties. For the moment, two such merit our attention. First, stories are a way of representing the world. Cognitively speaking, they are models of the world in the broad sense of the term. As models, they portray, stand for, or represent some small part of the world. Take, for instance, a group performing some ritual or another, say a rain ritual. When asked about the significance of their action, one hears to get a story. Such a story depicts a set of events which includes the performing of the rain ritual. Now, it is not the case that causal efficacy is attributed to the performance of such a ritual. The members of the group do not believe that their singing and chanting in some way and pouring ghee to the fire altar caused the rains to come. They are not justifying this belief by telling a story. What then are they doing? Because stories are models of a situation, as models, these stories are neither true nor false. It is only in models that statements come out as true or false. When a ritual is performed and the rains do not come, the group experiences this situation as something having gone wrong somewhere. When the rains do come, then everything is as it should be. What are these experiences signaling? They signal that the world is experienced as an order, and the truth and falsity of the explanation about the nature of the order is irrelevant to the experience that the world is an order. However, in any culture, at any moment of time, hypotheses which purport to explain the order of the universe float around. Some are another account of the pattern that one's culture and the cosmos exhibit, and some explanation of the role of individual actions with respect to sustaining or disrupting the order. And many such explanations, philosophical, theological, scientific, have come and gone. Why does not the sense of order also follow suit? We can best answer this question if we ask how cultures manage to sustain this sense of order in the cosmos and society in the absence of knowledge about the pattern. What mechanisms preserve the sense of order which the culture and cosmos exhibit, even when the knowledge about the order is absent? One such mechanism is the stock of stories that a culture possesses. So stories preserve patterns without saying what these patterns are. They depict partial aspects of an order without specifying what the order consists of. Performing the ritual, the coming of rains, etc., is a sequence of events described in a story without specifying the relations between these events. The experience of something having gone wrong somewhere and that of everything is as it should be are expressions of disturbance and appropriateness, accordingly as whether the story is not or is a model of the situation. Stories do not explain anything because they do not model relations, causal or otherwise, between events. In very simple terms, they just model a set of affairs. Thus, the representational aspect of the stories makes them continuous with other representational products known to us, like philosophy, scientific theories, etc. But of course, there are also differences between them. Whereas theories claim to explain, stories make no such claim. Theories may justify some belief one might have, but stories do not. Nevertheless, stories are pedagogical instruments to the extent they are representational. It is thus that stories embody some kind of knowledge. That is, they are units of learning. What kind of knowledge do these stories embody? In which kind of learning process are the units? Here is the second property of stories. Apart from exhibiting the representational property, stories possess a practical one too. In describing a way of going about the world, they are also a way of going about the world. They are models in a practical sense, that is, they can be emulated. Stories are pedagogical instrument par excellence because of this. How can stories teach us to do anything? How can they be instructional? That is, instruct us to do anything at all. How can a description of a way of going about in the world be itself a way of going about the world? As stories, they do not come with any explicit morals attached to them. They do not say, the moral of the story is. They are not structured as manuals of practical action either. Do X in order to achieve Y. If they teach, it is because of the way learning occurs in India. Consequently, the question becomes, what kind of learning activity is required if stories are how one learns? My answer is that it is mimetic learning. As stories, they are set of propositions. What they depict are actions. Between these actions and those of one's own, what obtains a practical relation and images. Only as such do stories function as instructions for actions. Stories combine this double function. They are theoretical and practical at the same time. They are not simple instructions, nor are they merely representation. They entertain too, but not the way the Little Red Riding Hood does. Understanding and imitation fall together. To understand is to imitate is to understand. Stories are instructions disguised as representations. One learns while one is not aware that one is learning, or mimesis is subintentional learning. Models of teaching can teach if they dovetail with the process of learning. Thus, stories can teach if, and only if, exemplars are the units of a learning process. Consequently, in a culture where mimetic learning is not a dominant mode, like the West, there the stories do not play the same role. They may entertain, take one's fancy, capture one's imagination, but instruct they cannot. In such a culture, stories become a genre of literature and mostly remain at that level. Narration would be different from instruction. If, on the other hand, narration is to become coextensive with instruction, either the narrative or the narrator must carry instructional authority. Neither the stories nor the storytellers carry this label on their sleeves. It is not even the case that stories about gods or respected figures, like say a Buddha or a Shankara, are sufficient to lend instructional authority to the narrative. That is to say, stories are not emulated because they portray action executed either by divine or human authorities. What then lends instructional authority to stories? This is the same as asking what makes stories into units of a learning process. Thus, mimetic learning, to summarize what I've said so far, is learning through exemplars. They are both representational and can be emulated. That is, the dominant mode of learning in India is mimetic or exemplary learning. The knowledge that such a learning produces is what I call action knowledge. Now, I want to focus a little bit on this, something very special about this action knowledge, some very counterintuitive properties it possesses. And this is what I want to now talk about properties of action knowledge. Suppose that you're a social worker, busy with, say, immigrant children from the neighborhood. You have undertaken many activities to integrate them better into the neighborhood social life, and currently you're at a loss about how to proceed further. That is, you don't know what to do next. While wrestling with the problem arising out of the desire to do something new and not knowing what it is that you should do, you meet an old friend. In the process of conversation, he casually mentions about some activity that an acquaintance of his undertook in, say, an old people's house. As soon as you hear about it, you suddenly know what your next action with the immigrant children should be. In all probability, your future action is different from the activity at the old people's home. What exactly has happened here? I would suggest that the activity performed at the old people's home functioned as an exemplar. That is, it functioned as a generative action. In the first place, this is what an exemplar is. It creates new, original actions. Now, there are two ways of understanding this. One is to say that the linguistic description of the action gives you a new idea about the future action. But there is also a second way of constructing the statement. That person's action in the old house generates a new action. You are now able to perform a new action which you could not do before. While you might be able to describe that future activity, this description or conception of the action is parasitic upon the ability to execute the same. Now, or in exactly the same way, someone's idea or thought or theory can create a new idea, thought or a theory in your head in exactly the same way someone's action is capable of generating new action, not an idea of a new action. Now this might sound spooky. However, it is not spookier than the fact that ideas can give birth to new ideas. So if ideas can give birth to new ideas, I don't see why actions cannot give birth to new actions. Actions give birth to new and original actions the way ideas generate novel ideas. In other words, you have acquired action knowledge now. That is, when described from your point of view, your ability to produce a new action now is what it means to speak of you having acquired knowledge. In this case, the exemplar happened to be a linguistic description of someone's action. And quite obviously, it need not be so in all cases. You may see someone doing something, and that enables you to execute a new action as well. In both cases, the learning process is the same. Learning through an exemplar or mimetic learning. Consequently, it must be clear that mimesis is creative and dynamic. Consider a second property of action knowledge. In our case, this old people's house, the exemplar happened to be a very specific action, undertaken by a very specific individual in a very specific context. Yet, it was able to create the ability to execute an entirely different action in another specific individual in a very different context. All exemplars are always context bound. Nevertheless, they are generated in entirely different contexts. Put even more clearly, the context dependence of an action makes it fertile in different contexts. Our general intuition regarding the nature of guidelines or decision principles is that the more general, abstract and context independent they are, the more useful and true they are. In fact, this is a demand we make upon all knowledge claims. A moral principle, a legal statute is acceptable if and only if it enables one to choose and execute the right action in all or most cases or contexts. For that to happen, a moral principle requires to be context-free. However, for action knowledge, it goes the other way. The intercontextual applicability is directly proportional to its contextual embeddedness and inversely to its context insensitivity and generality. Let's look at the third property of action knowledge. Even though you knew what you wanted to achieve, namely you wanted to do something, the knowledge of this goal, together with the knowledge about your present state, did not help you in producing a new action. In addition, your learning through the exemplar occurred when you were not aware that you were learning. That is to say, your ability to execute a new action is indifferent to the presence or absence of goals, or action knowledge is not goal dependent. Even though we speak about action as something that is related to a goal, action knowledge is completely independent of goal. One of the basic beliefs in the Western tradition is that human action is goal-oriented action, and that this constitutes an intrinsic property of human action. If I am right, just the opposite is true. Intrinsically, human action is goalless. Quite obviously, this does not prevent you from finding a goal for an action when you have action knowledge. But mimesis, as sub-intentional learning that involves the ability to execute actions, does not require the presence of goals. Practical activity, practical knowledge, as a species of knowledge, is neither intentional nor goal-directed. Consider the fourth property of action knowledge. In your situation, you did not know what to do. It's not as though you had difficulty in choosing between alternatives open to you. You have not chosen between an action you are now able to execute and the action alternatives which existed previously. Instead, acquiring the ability to execute a new action is the same as knowing what to do. There are more interesting, very counterintuitive properties of action knowledge, but I shall leave it here. But now, why do you have to accept my story at all? I mean, why do I have to, I'm making all kinds of philosophically crazy claims? Let me now turn my attention to outlining some empirical hypotheses that seem to follow if we accept the idea that mimesis is a way of learning characteristic to India. In fact, I believe that it is typical of the Asian culture and not restricted to India alone. Let me give you some empirical hypotheses that follow from this. If socialization involves mimesis, and families are the primary units of socializing a human infant, the success of the socialization process depends on what exactly the family models. In its important details, the family must be continuous with the moral community at large. The contrast between family as a moral arena, as Indian culture sees it, and family as a haven in a heartless world, this is one of the titles of Christopher Lash's book on family, haven in a heartless world cannot be sharper. In Western families, one is to experience love. One learns to be oneself. The socializing or the educative role of the family is secondary. It is derivative. Its primary task is to protect the child from the cruel world out there. It prepares the child to face up to the cold and indifferent world, and it does so by providing that love and understanding which gives the child the courage to go out and get what it wants. Family in the Western culture is the only oasis in the desert of social life, whereas in India, family completely models the moral arena and the social life. First hypothesis about the difference between families follows. Second, mimesis entails a reproduction of existing actions. That is, it essentially conserves. A culture dominated by mimetic learning exhibits a very strong pull towards conservatism. Indian culture is essentially conservative. Traditions, the past, etc., weigh on the members of such a culture. Third hypothesis. Learning through mimesis requires the development of ability to discriminate finely. One has to sort out situations and actions in such a way that one distinguishes between emulation in different situations from each other. Not all aspects of an event or action should be emulated. In other words, one grows to be a member of such a culture by acquiring a finely tuned set of discriminating criteria. Fourth hypothesis. If a learning process entails construction of instructional authorities, its impact can be observed in other spheres as well. To appreciate the force of this suggestion, look at the history of the West. Each challenge to authorities, be they clerical, biblical, political, or judicial, has precipitated a deep crisis in this culture. Challenges of similar nature, there have been many such, have hardly rippled the fabrics of social life in India. Fifth consequence, if action of action knowledge is neither intentional nor goal-directed, the problem of action could hardly be about the relation between intending and acting. All philosophers talk that as one of the basic problems of action, human action. However, if order requires the presence of underlying laws and principles, it is obvious that action, typically human action, demands that a conception guides it. Action becomes nothing but applied conception, practice nothing but applied theory, and technology nothing but applied science. However, this view is one culture's way of looking at the issue. Let me summarize what I said so far. Action knowledge is not knowledge about actions, but the ability to execute new actions. Action knowledge is acquired through mimesis, which is a process of learning through exemplars. Actions generate actions, not ideas about actions, in exactly the same way ideas generate ideas. Action and action knowledge are intrinsically goalless and require contextual embeddedness. How much of what I've said is so far unique to the Indian or Asian culture? Is there no mimetic learning in the West? Is mimesis not culture specific? At first sight, it would appear that mimesis is omnipresent in the West as well. Children learn through imitation. An adult learns to eat with chopsticks or learns to dance through imitative actions. An academic imitates his more successful colleagues by trying to publish as many articles as he possibly can, etc. Now, if stories about individuals have to function as exemplars, then either the narrative or the narrator must embody instructional authority. At first sight, it would appear that such moral authorities do exist in the Western culture. Some saints or priests, perhaps the figure of Jesus Christ, or figures like Martin Luther King or even Gandhi. If you call them moral ideals, such people appear to play the role of exemplars. One is inspired by their lives, one takes them as an ideal to emulate, one is exhorted to follow in their footsteps, etc. However, it is also the case that moral learning, that is learning to act morally, is seen to consist of two steps. One, making some set of moral principles one's own, and an attempt to apply them as consistently as possible. In the process of maturation from childhood to adulthood, one learns moral principles. Having transversed this phase, the rest of one's life consists of success and failures in the application of these principles. This is more or less what moral life is in the West is. The link between these two, between the existence of instructional authorities and the notion of moral knowledge as knowledge of principles, is obvious. These moral ideals embody some or another set of principles. Consequently, none of the above figures embody the moral principles. That some individual happens to subscribe, then these ideals cease to have instructional authority. Furthermore, it is not necessary that moral principles be embodied. Acceptance of moral principles is not parasitic upon the existence of ideals. The point of this contrast is the following. Morally exemplary figures in the West are not exemplars in the sense in which I am using the term. An exemplar is a unit of learning, and moral ideals in the West are never that. I have to stop at 11, isn't it? So I have to stop at 11 o'clock, isn't it?
A bit more time, please.
Okay, then I think I'll be able to finish it. In about 10 minutes? You're not falling off to sleep as yet? No? Now, what I want to do is now concentrate just a little bit on cognitive science and philosophy of mind to see whether action knowledge is something like a skill or something like what is called knowing how and knowing that. So I'll very quickly go through it. Consider the following example, original to Gilbert Ryle, about a skilled mountaineer stuck on a mountain. At a loss to negotiate the obstacle that is in front of him, he observes a monkey performing some sequence of actions. That inspires him to develop new strategies, new ways of circumventing the problem. The result of this strategizing is a successful climb. A Rylean would see this improvisation as a part of being a skilled mountaineer. Consequently, the suggestion about learning through exemplar can be assimilated with Rylean knowing how and knowing that. That is to say, the process of learning through exemplars may be conceptualized as a process of acquiring a skill. As a result, the notion of skill is reintroduced in this story at a meta level, knowing how to identify and use an exemplar and knowing that something is an exemplar. As an ability to produce new actions, action knowledge cannot be a skill because any skilled action has a history with respect to the organism in question. The characteristic property of action knowledge is the novelty and originality of the action. However, it is possible to argue that to speak of a skilled chess player, a skilled surgeon, or a skilled driver is to speak of precisely their ability to improvise in new situations, come up with new actions. After all, skill is not an execution of drilled actions, even if some kind of drill is required in acquiring the skill. However, it appears to me that the new action of a skilled practitioner arises through a combination of familiar actions. That is to say, it's like generating a new word out of an existing repertoire of words. Even more importantly, in at least some circumstances, the skill of combining familiar actions is not sufficient to improvise. A skilled mountaineer stuck on the mountain, absently watching a monkey move from place to place, is able to do something new by taking the actions of the monkey as an exemplar. Prior to this learning episode, there was an action he could not generate out of the repertoire of actions he had. If he could have, he would not have been stuck there in the first place. To be sure, he needed his skills in order to learn what he learned from the monkey's movement. You and I, watching the same monkey's action, would not be able to do what the skilled mountaineer did. In this sense, learning through exemplars cannot be the same as a skill to identify and use an exemplar. Consider a surgeon who intends to use radiation therapy on his patient in order to destroy a tumor. Though a concentrated high dose is required, to use it would be fatal to the patient. While thinking about this problem, he hears of an army general who conquered a fortress by sending his army in several very small units and had them converge upon the fortress from different directions. This story enables a surgeon to do the following. He now radiates the tumor in minute doses, each of them converging upon the tumor from different directions. This story is one of the examples used in studying the role of analogies and metaphors in human problem-solving processes. The claim of cognitive scientists working in this domain is that analogies and metaphors play a role in discovering the solution, the way the story of the general inspired a possible solution to the doctor's dilemma. In other words, what I would have called exemplar is what they call an analogy. To the extent they are part of the learning process, the use of analogies and metaphors tell us that one learns using examples. Examples are illustrations of some general principle or the other. To learn through examples is to discover the general principles that are instanced. Consequently, analogies and metaphors turn out to be good examples. That is, they are a subset of examples. It appears to me that this exactly is what exemplars are not. They are not examples because they do not instantiate anything. Such a process is what we call inductive learning. That is, it induces general principles from a set of particular instances. One gleans the knowledge of general laws, and these pertain to the domain of theoretical knowledge. However, it appears to me that one does not induce any principle while learning through mimesis. In addition, the knowledge that one acquires is an ability to perform or execute some knowledge of action. Hence, I would like to speak of action knowledge as a distinct species of knowledge. If learning is a process of creating a habitat, it involves several things: the ability to build and sustain social interactions, the ability to think about nature, society, and so on. Each cultural group develops one of these into a dominant mode. Other kinds and ways of learning continue to exist and develop. However, they do so within a dominant configuration, both modified by and subordinated to such a configuration. Even if mimesis is the process of developing action knowledge, a culture dominated by the latter requires theoretical knowledge to survive. However, the mode of theoretical learning emerges within the overarching frame of practical learning. In other words, and I'm more or less finished, in other words, if you look at stories as part of a learning configuration, as a process of learning process and so on, and in that sense stop looking at them as texts with structures and embodying all kinds of patterns which repeat themselves endlessly across the tropes or whatever it is, and we relate them to culture, it appears to me that we'll be able to profitably look at what stories are and what stories do. Now there's just one last point before I end. You see, you can look at human beings in different ways. You can look at them as biological, you can look at them at a cellular level, you can look at them at a social level, you can look at them at a genetic level, you can look at them at a psychological level. In other words, different levels of description, true descriptions of human beings are possible. So what I'm proposing is not that my story about stories is an alternative to all existing, perhaps, but definitely it is one level of true description which I think allows us to understand and answer the question, why is it cultures like India, Japan, China, or Asian cultures in general, or even like cultures like Greece, ancient Greece, had such a tremendous stock of stories which over a period of time, with the development of within the Western culture, continuously began to disintegrate. Ulu, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you. I kept to my time.
Thank you. Did you know that you are a professional folklorist? This was advanced folklore, narrative theory.
Thank you.
And now we have some time to discuss, to ask questions. Well, let me start then. One of the points in the lecture was how stories and then action, how they related, how stories lead to action. And when I think about the history of my country, Estonia, that became independent again, and the role of stories in this process was tremendous. I'm referring to the oral history, the memories of the people, the stories about the violence, the occupation, the terror that were not there in official history. And this knowledge that was transmitted from generation to generation, it finally led to the independence, the new independence of the country. Well, the independence of India occurred much earlier. But I wonder, is there also some kind of connection between the stories on the grand scale, like epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, or on more folkloric scale that led to this great political changes, getting rid of the British in India?
I don't think there were any new stories, but in certain areas I think what happened was Gandhi was mapped out to certain figures we knew of the stories, okay, as some kind of an enlightened man, as not to use another word, something like a saint, something like a guru. So it was possible to identify leaders of the movement with figures which play a tremendously important role in the stories which are told to everyone in different versions in different parts of India. So there might have been other local stories in different, for example, Punjab, that might have existed a story which I don't know. But I don't think independence movement as such generated a story. Independence movement was subordinated to other stories that already existed. It's more that. I don't think it itself generated powerful stories. And the fact that it did not shows why, after independence, Gandhi could not anymore dominate the social life in India. That is the Congress party which did it. Okay? That shows that the Indian national movement did not generate any powerful story of its own. Otherwise it could not have, otherwise Gandhi would not have been marginalized the way he was marginalized. I know that answers your question.
Yes, sure, thank you.
But is this unity of India also a story?
What?
The idea of India,
Yeah.
of the unity of India, is a huge story which led to independence movement too.
Not really. Not really, no. That is what the BJP is not trying to create. But that is not true. You see, for example, if you look at the Indian stories, it ranges all the way to Cambodia. Cambodia was in our stories, is a Cambodia. There's a Thailand, Suvarnadvipa. And all these sages from all over, they were part of India, and they came and they become our sages and so on and so forth. So this, even though there is on the one hand the notion of India, and there are certain stories about how India is defined in four different directions, really it didn't play that big a role at all. It's playing a role now with the BJP, but the independence movement, not really. The reason why it did not is the following, you see. After the independence movement, we still saw the British Queen as our queen. So if we really saw the British as something different, let me give you an example. Late 50s, Queen Elizabeth came to India on a ship. And she brought her own water bottles. Yeah? And so she would not drink Indian water. It was a huge insult to the Indian people. I mean, it all came in all papers, and I remember me talking to my mother and crying that she wouldn't accept our water, because it's a very big insult in India if you don't accept water. Okay, so the fact that Elizabeth did not, who is our queen, that's how we looked at her, did not accept water, we felt very deeply insulted. So there was, in that sense, except in certain parts of India, there was no hatred for the British at all.
Yes, and I meant like the unity of India from ancient times.
Yeah.
This territory of India.
Aryavarta. You're talking about Aryavarta. Well, I'm saying that is what is popularized today. Today.
So it's a new idea that's brought up.
No, it's there, but it never really... See, nationalism is very alien to India, you see.
You mean the stories like from the village level or everyday level, and not so abstract? You mean that activity learning?
No, what I mean is this. See, if you want to talk about national unity, then you have to talk in terms of some or another idea of a nationalism. Okay? I mean, you can have a nation without nationalism, of course. So India was a nation without nationalism. So this idea of unity of India is part of a nationalist story. And that is something which began with the emergence of the BJP, or even before that with the Jansangh, RSS and so on. So it begins around middle of the 19th century. But it is not part of the Indian tradition.
In continuation of Professor Balagangadhara has said and a young lady's question, I think like if you look at the works of Bashan, I think the idea of panoptic unity, an organic unity, is not even important. If we look at the Mahabharata model of warfare, or the Chanakyan model of warfare, warfare between kings is often a duel. Not often, but in the south the Pandyan kingdoms have a story where two kings actually settle a war by dueling individually. So warfare even in the Magadhan times didn't disturb cultivation patterns, settled agriculture. Plus, the modern Indian state seems to have, this is also very mimetic, copied certain Euro-American notions of stability and concreteness. Concreteness in India has never been that of an organic nation state. The concept of Chakravartin, which is the supreme ruler, is not a person who closely controls all parts of the empire. If you look twice in Indian history, there have been imperial expansion in that sense. Samudragupta and even the Mauryas. They just made the kings, the local kings, accept their token moral suzerainty and then let them be. So the idea that the modern Indian state has a very all-pervasive idea, which I believe is partially responsible for certain insurgency problems. Partially, there are other issues too. That if you are not organically united, then you are gone. The Indian ideal always has been that there is actually the happiest times in Indian history have been when India was without a strong central head.
Absolutely right. There's something very strange. There are lots of interesting things in that context. Indian society, as I said, there are two notions in physics called centrifuge, where things get attracted to the center. And the notion of centripetal, that is, things fly away from the center. Now, India would be very typically centripetal. It's not centrifugal at all. We really don't give a damn what laws are made. You must look at the ordinary people. To give you a very, very stupid example. An MLA gets elected, and suddenly the street he's living in becomes a one-way street. Okay? You know how the people react? Oh, screw the fellow, just because he becomes an MLA, you think we can't go, so they keep on driving. So for the first few days, policeman stands, but people keep on trafficking, so after a few days, policeman goes away, and the one-way street is gone also. And people just don't care. But imagine something like that happening in Belgium. It's out of the question. It's one way, it's one way. And the policeman is standing there, and you're going to get processed for bar, or you get reported, you get tickets, you get fines. And then people say, no, it's not possible. This is the way we've been doing it. Who is this MLA? So, I can give you hundreds of thousands of examples. We're not worried about what laws are made. We just do what we think, what we have been doing all along. Okay. So, the kind of unity in India is quite different. Quite different. Okay.
Thank you for presentation. Very good was your speech. But I must ask first, what means the word India for you? What means India? Please define word India. So as I know, in the world this term was defined differently. For me, that means you think that India is now a Republic of India, or geographically is more more broader than Republic of India. And historically also India has some meanings. In every story, the word India is different meaning. But you now used the word Aryavarta. Aryavarta is connected with Aryans and Aryan languages, as you know, but Dravidian languages.
Well,
No, it is not all. And as I know, is the theory that Aryans were colonists in India. So from third, second millennium before Christ is a colonial explanation. Now I know in India is also our theories who explain that Aryans are originally Indians and they are going from India to northern countries. It's also one story. So many stories about this, but how you define the word India?
It's not a problem, but I call, to me, India, it is a theoretical term I'm using, as a culture. And to me, culture is a configuration of learning. So to me, India, when I use the word India, I refer to a configuration of learning, not to languages, not to history, not to geographical territories, nothing. Where, for example, numeric learning dominates and generates a configuration of learning. So where such a, what I call a configuration of learning exists, where practical knowledge dominates in India. And the West, for example, is to be a configuration of learning where theoretical knowledge dominates. So my notion of India and Europe, and the West, if you like, doesn't face the problem that you're in. Is that an answer to your question?
Aryans?
Aryans have nothing to do with my story. That is a discussion that's going on with, well, see, first of all, it appears to me quite obvious that I've been in contact between India and other groups, in old India, if you like, other groups. There have been migration of all kinds of groups. So this whole debate about Aryan immigration is absolute rubbish. It's a useless discussion. It's a meaningless discussion. There have been contact, any culture in the world has had contact with other groups in other cultures. So in that sense, what we call India today, the Republic of India, is a result of interaction between many groups. So this whole story about Aryan migration and whether the Aryans came from Iran and Afghanistan to India, and anyway the opposite story is absolute rubbish. Indians going to Iran and so on, it's absolute nonsense. But that such groups did come from Iran and Afghanistan appears to me very obvious. There's nothing wrong with it. What's the problem with it? See, the Aryan immigration has another reason why it has become such a huge controversy. One of my doctoral students is working on that. To find out where that story about Aryan invasion arose, Aryan migration arose, what the discussion is, what the problems are. And at the moment, there are really no problems. And this whole story is simply blown out of proportions by, on the one hand, BJP, on the other hand, their critics in Harvard University. Michael Witzel and idiots like that. It's not an interesting discussion.
Yeah. What is called action knowledge is also other way is called educative function of folklore. It is universal, nothing specific to India.
You are making a statement saying 2 and 2 is equal to 15. What am I supposed to say? You have to prove that, no? You have to prove that, no? I'm not saying educative function at all. I'm not speaking about educative function of stories. I'm talking about stories as units of learning.
Stories?
As units of learning.
Okay.
I'm not talking about educative function. You might be educated. You can read Jane Austen and somebody might get educated here, whatever that might mean. But I'm being a bit more precise than that. I'm saying the function is units of learning.
That is vocabulary. Finally,
It is not vocabulary because that's why there's a lot of background to this paper. I took the example of morality. Now, one of the characteristics of all Indian languages here is another possibility for you to show that I'm wrong. Even in Assamese, I don't know Assamese, right? You cannot formulate a statement in Assamese which says you ought not to kill. Can you say that?
You ought not to?
Kill.
It will be difficult.
You cannot say, not difficult. You can only say you should not kill, you must not kill. Yeah, it has the same structure as a sentence. You must not drink water. You must not scratch your skin. In the same way you say you must not kill. You cannot say you ought not to kill. No Asian language has that possibility. In other words, if that is true, then there are no such thing as moral principles. You can't formulate a moral principle in any of the Asian languages. So, whereas typical of morality is supposed to be having moral principles. That is why the Westerners said that Indians don't have moral principles and they are immoral. Now we are not immoral, but it is true we have no moral principles. So in a culture where it is not possible to form moral principles, ethical learning takes place through stories. Okay? So it's not simply educating. Whereas here in the West, you have, because of historical reasons, you have clear moral principles, whether it is in French or in German or in Dutch or I don't know in Estonian, but in Swedish, in all these languages, you can say you ought not to kill, you ought to respect your parents, and stuff like that. So here the stories do not play the role they play in ethical learning in India. So I'm not speaking generally abstractly about educative role of stories. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Yeah? I mean, Sherlock Holmes might also be educative. But the point is that even if you look at those points of view, look at the incredible stock of stories in India. Why is it they don't exist here? Why they died out? Ancient Greece had it, but they died out. Even something like Panchatantra, for example, plays a different role. Whereas Aesop's fables plays a different role here. So that is what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So I think we thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.